As more and more begin to know, the status quo has got to go. They're bound to say yes to a man named Dr. No, a man who makes the establishment panic. Grassroots are growing way too wild, too organic.
So the G7 leaders said in a joint statement, quote, "Today we are launching negotiations with Ukraine to formalize through bilateral security commitments and arrangements aligned with this multilateral framework in accordance with our respective legal and constitutional requirements, our enduring support to Ukraine," end quote. So the G7 said that each member will work with Ukraine on specific bilateral long-term security commitments and arrangements. So Wallace said, quote, "Whether we like it or not, people want to see a bit of gratitude," end quote. So a day earlier, Zelensky said, it was absurd, and he just really went after NATO for not giving him what he wanted. And Wallace said that Ukraine had a habit of being ungrateful and treating its NATO backers like an Amazon warehouse. And he was basically giving them advice saying, if you want to get more money and weapons from countries, you should be a little more polite. It was essentially what he was saying, but it was interesting. He said, quote, "I told them that last year when I drove 11 hours to be given a list, that I'm not like Amazon," end quote. So it sounds like he's talking about when he went to Kiev and, he got there and they just handed him over a list of things that they wanted. And, throughout the war, Zelensky and other Ukrainian officials have not been shy to say, even though they're getting tens of billions of dollars in military aid, they haven't been afraid to say it's not enough. They've said that when Zelensky addressed Congress, and, that's what he said. That's one of the things. We're getting artillery. We need more. That's been their message, this whole time. And as soon as they get the things that they're asking for, they move on to the next thing. It was tanks, they got the tanks, now they're after the jets, they got the jets, now they're trying to get longer range missiles, and they've had some success there. So NATO drew 4 Indo-Pacific countries tighter into its orbit on Wednesday as China hit back against the security alliance's eastward march. So leaders from Australia, Japan, New Zealand, and South Korea met with NATO's 31 members in Vilnius. So they were there, and China was on the agenda. So I went over yesterday, the communique really targeted China, and Stoltenberg, just in his press conferences, really went after China as well. So ahead of the talks, Japanese Prime Minister Fumio Kishida said that in the current severe international security environment, the security of Europe and the Indo-Pacific are inseparable. So he says that they're, trying to increase cooperation with NATO. A partnership agreement signed by Kishida and NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg vowed to uphold freedom, democracy, human rights, and the rule of law. So they signed this new partnership agreement. And they're still hoping to get this NATO liaison office that France has so far blocked. But these Japanese officials are speaking to the South China Morning Post, are saying that they hope, they get it down the line. And Stoltenberg was saying that it's going to happen, or that, the idea is shelved, but they're going to still try to do it, is basically what Stoltenberg was saying about it. But of course, China hit out at all this and is telling NATO, stay out of the Asia Pacific. The next one here is from Middle East Eye. Republicans accuse Biden of anti-Semitic, anti-Israel policies. So 14 U.S. senators said that they would work to delay confirmation of State Department officials unless the Biden administration reverses its anti-Semitic boycott of Israel. So this is several Republican senators, including some of the heavy hitters: Lindsey Graham, Marco Rubio, James Reich, Tom Cotton, Ted Cruz. They wrote a letter addressed to Biden and Blinken, and they're really unhappy that Biden, last month, he suspended the transfer of funds for research, science, or technology projects taking place in the occupied West Bank. That was a thing that Trump authorized in late 2022, was allowing U.S. taxpayer funding to be used for projects in Israeli settlements in the occupied West Bank for the first time since 1967. So Biden reversed that, and they're very mad, and they're calling him anti-Semitic for it. It's the original cancel culture here is politicians that don't think you support Israel enough. And they're also mad at Biden for not meeting with Netanyahu, I believe. You can never do enough for Israel for people like this.
Your daily dose of liberty education starts here. The Tom Woods Show.
So good. Okay, Tom. This is going to be a surprise.
Yeah, so his first argument basically boiled down to this. He said, my first argument is nobody really believes the non-aggression principle. And what he meant by that is, if your principle is you cannot initiate coercion, and initiating coercion includes aggressing against the private property rights of another person, if that's what your statement is, then you definitely don't believe it. Because I'll give you an example. So he gives the example of somebody falls out a window of a tall building, but somehow by his good fortune as he's tumbling down, he grabs hold of a flagpole that's all the way up at the 9th floor.
There's a balcony in this case, but go ahead. Yes,
balcony, right. Yeah, you're right, a flagpole. You're right. and he manages to grab hold of it, but that's the only thing keeping him from plummeting to his death. But then the owner of the flagpole says, I don't give you permission to be holding onto my flagpole. And Friedman says, how many people in this audience would therefore let go? Of course, nobody would, so therefore you don't believe in the non-aggression principle. That's one. And then a very similar case, it's almost the same case. There's a mad shooter who's out there killing people, and there's a gun right next to you that you could pick up and shoot him with. But you know that the owner of that gun has publicly said that I don't ever want anybody else to use my gun. But yet, I'm virtually certain every one of you would pick that gun up and violate his private property rights to go shoot the crazed killer. So again, you don't really believe in the non-aggression principle. So I hate to...
Go ahead.
I won't. I was going to summarize your response. Since you were here, why don't I let you make the response?
Okay, that's fair enough. That's fine. You know that I believe that our mentor, Murray Rothbard, would have dismissed such arguments by resorting to the old cliche, hard cases make bad law. In Ethics of Liberty, I think Rothbard talked about, lifeboat ethics. If you cut off people's arms to eat and all the stuff that you do on a lifeboat, if you're starving to death, and it dismissed that as irrelevant to the real world. And my initial instinct was to realize that perhaps I could counter with another case that I didn't even mention. Jean Valjean tries to steal a loaf of bread, breaks the window, but he committed a crime. That's in Les Miserables, committed a crime.
Which we just saw in London, by the way, last week.
Well, I'll ask you how it was, but we don't want to digress.
Yeah, I'll tell you later, though. It was the best performance of it I've ever seen, but go ahead.
Wow, that's good to know. I spoke to our mutual friend, Stefan Kinsella, who is a lawyer and whose specialty is, of course, the philosophy of law and the rest of it. And he confirmed my view that it's really not glib or just a play on semantics to say that in all cases, in those two cases, you have committed a crime. And that therefore we unflinchingly say that simply because under certain rather bizarre circumstances. I thought that flagpole story was pretty crazy because, as I jokingly said, if somebody grabbed my flagpole, my balcony, I wouldn't press charges because, by the way, in the libertarian world, the injured party presses the charges. I would just marvel at his physical dexterity, since it is a rather fantastic story, and that you could break your fall by grabbing onto the flagpole. And I would say, look, I'm only happy my flagpole was there to save your life. But the point is, that doesn't change the fact that it would be a crime. And all I said was that, or I said it in different ways because David challenged me later in another way, which I want to get into, about this particular point. I said that the crime, it's always and absolutely a crime to invade somebody's property. But in certain extreme cases, there are extenuating circumstances. And Stefan kept pointing out, in most cases, the injured party wouldn't even bring charges against the person who committed the crime. That's possible too. So the crime is absolute. The question is, what is the penalty? And in so much of law, the extenuating circumstances are often considered by the judge and jury. Therefore, but then when David later on seemed to be shocked that I said I would commit the crime, he said, well, if you would commit the crime, how can you call it a crime? I said, well, maybe because I'm a criminal. Just because I would commit the crime under the circumstances that he mentioned, that I'm saving the world from extinction. That was another example he had, which is that I steal $100 worth of equipment in order to prevent an asteroid from destroying the world. And the fact that I would do that means that it's not a crime. Just because I am prepared to do that doesn't mean it's not a crime. I would be prepared to do that under the certain rather bizarre circumstances that David set forth. And I don't think that it's glib to point that out. I use the analogy with murder. You're driving a truck, your truck kills somebody, and then as a matter of law, the question is, to what extent are you guilty? If your tire blew out, then the question is, were you tending to your tires? Maybe you had new tires. Maybe it was just a tragic accident for which you can't be held accountable. But in all cases, somebody was killed. So my point again was that the extenuating circumstances apply, but it's always and everywhere a violation of rights. And merely because you're willing to do it doesn't mean it's not a violation of rights.
You can find that one. There we go. New Twitter files contradict FBI director's testimony. So just shortly after he gave his testimony, and I did not watch all of it, I watched a few clips on Twitter, but I think I didn't have to watch it because Jonathan watched it for us. If you put the next one on, he characterizes it absolutely perfectly. He says, Ray continued to use his favorite testimonial trilogy to dismiss any questions, expressing 1, lack of knowledge, 2, ongoing investigations, and 3, promises of later answers or briefings. And then I highlighted this. He did, however, hold forth in detail after Representative Eric Swalwell asked him about FBI Family Day. So he was happy to talk about FBI Family Day, but literally everything else he was asked about was, and that refers back to the Massey thing I was mentioning about the pipe bombs. This is an investigation. I can't talk about it. So.
Yeah, and on one occasion, the statement was obviously false that he gave, about the FBI. The quote, the FBI maintained a large operation of agents actively seeking the censorship of thousands, as discussed in my prior testimony.
Yeah, the
same old baloney that they put up with. But this is why it's a pleasure for me to come across something that Jonathan has written, because you feel more comfortable. It doesn't make him perfect, and he doesn't any declare what his political absolutes are, but he's dedicated to finding the truth. And people who are really dedicated to finding the truth will realize that they're seeking truth and moving in a direction, because perfect truth is not something that people occasionally grab hold of. But he can be trusted. When you read that, he's put some effort into it. Taibbi is in that category now, who the two of them, are two individuals trying to reveal to us exactly what's going on.
Put on that next clip. This is what Ray claimed before Congress. He said, the FBI is not in the business of moderating content or causing any social media company to suppress or censor, end quote. Turley adds. He then added that these companies are not under any pressure in making their own decisions whether they censor people or groups flagged by the FBI. Turley continues. The statement is obviously false. The FBI maintained a large operation of agents actively seeking the censorship of thousands, as you point out, Dr. Paul, as discussed in my prior testimony. And Turley clips in the most recent Twitter files where you saw behind the scenes what was going on that Matt Taibbi, as you mentioned, pointed out. And put that next one up, because Matt Taibbi has discovered something that directly contradicts what Ray says and shows him to be an absolute and utter liar. Now here's Taibbi. He's talking about what he saw behind the scenes at Twitter. He said, in one shot, you can see the FBI asks to remove 3 accounts that gets forwarded to Twitter. Twitter immediately suspends them, the accounts. But more importantly, when there's a glitch and the accounts remain up, the FBI immediately writes back and says, what's the deal? We just wrote to you. Why is it still up? So that shows the nature of the relationship, basically, that it's not really a collaboration. It's more like somebody reporting to an authority. And he continues, I'm sorry this is long, but it's really important. What happens in these instances, this is Taibbi, in the ones that I was showing, they're just forwarding the names of accounts that they say are associated with foreign threat actors. It's very vague, and Twitter is taking them down before they even investigate. In this case, they later determined they couldn't find anything connecting them to any bad actors. In fact, one of them was from Canada. And so that's the problem. It's not connected. If it's not connected with the crime, they're just asking to take them down because they don't like the profile. Absolutely contradicting, Dr. Paul, what Ray says. The FBI is saying, take these down. Hey, why don't you take them down? Take them down. And again, the implied use of force of the federal government.
Yes, and I'm going to repeat what you said, because I have that quote right here just to emphasize that. If it's not connected with a crime, they're just asking to take accounts down because they don't like the people, the profile of them. Yeah. So it's a terrible indictment of what they're doing to the First Amendment, and it's so apparent now. But you'd think that that this would be waking more people up to it. But well, all we can do is our little effort to let as many people know as possible.
Mohammed bin Salman, the head of Saudi Arabia, to Blinken, no to Israel normalization, yes to Syrian reconciliation. And it's a long article. We won't go into all the details, but it's interesting because essentially, in poor old MBS, we haven't really been that sympathetic to him for a long time. But Blinken called him up at midnight, and they talked for a couple of hours. That must have been fun. That must have been real neat. But what happened is that Blinken was pushing the Saudis to push that normalization with Israel and to stop being so friendly to Syria. And MBS just said, no, I'm not going to do it. And I think the reason we wanted to bring it up is it just shows how fundamentally things have changed since Ukraine. over a year ago. You know, there was a really interesting article, and I don't have the author in front of me, but it was on the publication Unheard, H-E-R-D, which is a good sort of contrarian. But it was talking about how what's happening now is very similar to the really fundamentally changing 1848 revolutions in Europe. And what we're seeing is that kind of world revolution. And I think this is an example where you had the Saudis getting closer to the Israelis, reaching rapprochement, and then all of a sudden the U.S. blows this whole Ukraine thing up, and you see everything changing. The Saudis with the Iranians, the Saudis recognizing the Syrians, inviting them to their events, and snubbing the Israelis now, forgetting that, and even making peace in Yemen. So it's a fundamental shift.